I do not believe that the direct tangible benefit package should relieve RCI in any way of maintaining the current amount of corporate income tax paid into the system by McLean Hunter.
Mr. Mahar, please give our best to Mr. Whitehead when you see him again.
Thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
again, congratulations, and keep doing it. Keep coming back. It's exactly the kind of intervention we need. Thank you.
This is too much fun to stop.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
In September 1994, Keith Mahar left a corporate career in the Canadian broadcasting industry on a mission to change the world. A year later, he won a precedent-setting legal decision against a multi-billion-dollar corporation. A week before the legal victory, a Toronto publication illustrated him in a Superman costume and described him as hero of the 90s. A month after he testified to the Canadian Broadcasting Authority in 1996, Keith handed out thousands of dollars to homeless people in Toronto before marching naked through the perfume department of a major Toronto store. Keith was born in 1962, 6 months after his grandfather, Percival, died in a psychiatric institution. Keith's father developed bipolar disorder while the children were still very young. He was not diagnosed with a mental illness for 2 decades. Before Keith finished his secondary education, his father had experienced poverty and had been homeless for a short period of time. Keith experienced significant success in his education and employment endeavours. At 31, he was hired to a high-paying managerial position by a leading Canadian broadcasting company. By September 1994, Keith lost his faith in the integrity of the Broadcasting Authority and decided to change the system. Keith resigned from his job to publicly oppose a $3.1 billion media merger. In early 1995, a Labour union, 2 MPs and a seniors group supported Keith's appeal to Cabinet against the merger. When Cabinet rejected his appeal, Keith retained legal counsel. His lawyers confirmed there was evidence of illegal activity by the agency to improperly enrich shareholders of selected corporations. At the end of March 1995, 2 shadow ministers and a backbencher joined Keith and his lawyers at a Parliament Hill press conference and called on the federal government to initiate an investigation, but the government did not act. Keith sued his own cable TV company for a monthly rate refund of $2.52, the cost of the corruption to him personally. A smear campaign was commenced against him by those benefiting from the agency's corruption. Keith's mental state was publicly maligned in the press. Anonymous industry sources labelled him a nut, crank, fanatic and fruitcake. The tactic of using the stigma of mental illness to shield the case of corruption worked. There was no public outcry for an investigation into the government agency. Keith's corporate opponent hired one of the country's leading lawyers to head its defence team. The company won a precedent-setting decision on jurisdiction, protecting the legal right of the Broadcasting Authority to rule on the case. Accordingly, Keith's case was dismissed without a ruling on its merits. Later the same month, Keith won a precedent-setting decision on costs against the corporation. The judge refused to order him to pay any of the company's legal costs, ruling that the case was in the public interest and raised a genuine issue of law of significance to the public at large. In 1996, Keith and his legal counsel spent weeks preparing for a legal challenge against the regulator and selected corporations in federal court. Keith had been invited to appear before a parliamentary standing committee in May 1996 to comment on a proposed private members' bill related to the broadcasting sector. He was planning to use the opportunity to address the ongoing corruption. He never testified. Days before his scheduled appearance, Keith suffered a life-threatening episode of depression. Everything changed.
I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in May '96 while suffering a severe depression. At that time, I was experiencing extreme and intense suicidal thoughts. A psychiatrist told me during that time that it was impossible for me to return to my campaign as an activist. He did not understand that I was relying upon the hope of a rematch to help me combat those thoughts of suicide. I made a major mistake, however, by returning too soon to the issue and pushing myself far too hard. In October '96, I appeared before the Broadcasting Authority for the third time. 1 month after the televised public hearing, I experienced psychosis. I'm going to try to explain how one moment in a psychosis can have life-altering consequences. On November 14th, while looking at Zach, I realized that God is dog spelled backwards. Hours later, I gave away thousands of dollars to homeless people before walking naked in the city. In my psychotic state, I actually thought that I was somehow going to save people in the world from suffering simply by walking naked for the rest of my life, and it seemed a fair trade-off. The media coverage of my action was degrading. It's not very good for your reputation to walk around a city naked, and I was really unlucky because an employee of the company that I had sued recognized me in this state. The newspaper turned my misery into its page 2 story. While the people closest to me were beside themselves with worry about the possibility of me committing suicide, the newspaper increased the burden of the episode by printing a degrading article that focused on my body and turned the whole matter into a source of comedy for its readers. How did that newspaper know that the added humiliation of its type of coverage was not going to push me over the edge? My life was shattered, and I confess I was broken. I simply existed. In 1998, I met an Australian woman at a party in Toronto who looked past my diagnosis. We soon fell in love, but it didn't cure my mental illness, and I was still suffering. So in 2001, Gail pulled me down under, for a fresh start in Australia, and it made all the difference. Early the next year, I joined a grassroots mental health organization in Canberra as a volunteer. The decision turned out to be an important step in my recovery. As a result, I started to feel more productive again, more like myself. The next year, I also became a volunteer at the National Depression Initiative. In the same year, I was contracted for a day a week by the peak national body for the mental health sector. As a result of all those things combined, my confidence and self-esteem substantially increased and my recovery accelerated. I finally felt capable to consider my career options. This hadn't happened for years. I started a Bachelor of Social Work in 2005, and I'm really excited at the prospect of becoming a social worker. As for the psychiatrist who claimed it was impossible for me to return to my Canadian campaign, well, he was wrong. I am going to explain very clearly to the Canadian public how the stigma of mental illness has cost them more than $1 billion in my case. I'm aware that stress is a very negative thing for my health, but in comparison to what I've gone through battling my mental illness, a rematch is no more than a game, and that's how I'm going to treat it, as a game. I call the game Budge. Anyone online can watch how I play the game this time, as I've gone digital. It is the 21st century. My recovery took the better part of a decade, and it wasn't easy, but it was well worth the effort. It taught me patience, and it required me to gain insight in my mental illness and its treatments. Learning to better manage stress and to identify early warning signs of illness was also essential. Above all, I had to forgive myself for not being perfect. Who is?